I began writing The European Eel in the spring of 2019. The impetus for the book came maybe 18 months earlier in a chance exchange with Pete Wall, who was then Dearne Valley Living Landscape Manager for the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. Pete, who I'd known for some time, explained that he had introduced over 100,000 elvers to RSPB Old Moor as part of a strategy to attract nesting bitterns to the reserve. Eels are a favoured food of bitterns. Pete described how he'd become obsessed by eels, reading all that he could about them and even keeping a few in his garden pond. Pete's account triggered something in me. It wasn't a gradual thing. It was like being struck by lightning. In that moment, in that conversation, I knew I was going to write a book of poems about the European eel. Indeed, in that moment of realization, I couldn't believe I hadn't written about eels before, given my history and affinity with them. Primarily, of course, my surname is very Ely and is often given Old English etymologies related to the eel, eel catcher, eel place, and so on. Further, a significant part of my boyhood and early teenage years was spent angling on the River Wharfe near the Yorkshire hamlet of Ulleskelf, a place famous or notorious for eels. I was a very poor angler. I didn't even have my own tackle. I'd typically borrow my mates, and when they were hauling in pike and bream and tench and barbel and so on, all I ever landed was eels, and the first one I caught bit me. It dawned on me that this provided a unique, intimate connection with the species. Not many people have ever been bitten by an eel. It was like they recognized me and I'd been chosen. When a person is bitten by a wolf, they become a werewolf. When Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider, he became Spider-Man. Maybe I'd been a were-eel since I was 12 and had simply not noticed. Thus, I became hooked. I like to explore themes and content at scale, and I was soon conceiving of the eel-based book I was to write as a symphonic poem written in 4 movements. Although this bigger project, which I call Ely, a work in progress that will probably be published in 2023, explores a wide range of themes, including conflict, the Anthropocene and the 6th extinction, rewilding and the English fen. The whole piece is rooted in the opening movement, which has found its own independent life as the book I'm going to be reading from today, The European Eel. At the point of deciding to write about the eel, I didn't really know much about it, despite my history with it. I felt an obligation to address that deficit, so I did my research. I immersed myself in eel reading, dozens of books and monographs and hundreds of academic papers, and I got in touch with and took advice from several eel experts, including Matt Gollock, Marine and Freshwater Programme Manager at the Zoological Society of London, Paul Kemp, Professor of Ecological Engineering at the University of Southampton, and the aforementioned Pete Wall. I monitored eels on the River Roding with Norwegian biologist Hette Hultman, and was toured around a real wilding project on the Dutch Rhine by project leader Bram Huben. I spent a lot of time in wellies and chest waders, lurking in and around rivers, estuaries and streams. I trapped and released a number of eels and kept one in an aquarium for 4 months so that I might observe her behavior in order to inform the poem. When that eel, who with stunning banality I named Little Eel, began to transform from a yellow eel into a silver eel, meaning she was ready to migrate that autumn, I knew I'd found the structure for the European eel. An account of the life cycle, epic migration, ecological and conservation context of the European eel in an imagining of the little eel's life from egg to death. This content dictated the form. The poem became a kind of monological epic, a quest story in which a reliable third-person narrator provides an account of the deeds of Little Eel as a quasi-Homeric hero overcoming innumerable obstacles in the teleological quest to breed and die. The European eel is rooted in an immersion in scientific research, the research of others, I hasten to add. It is nevertheless a work of art. Artistic expression is not like scientific or academic expression. The artist is never in full conscious control of the upwelling of utterance, even if the work is planned, researched, and mapped out according to self-imposed didactic and formal constraints, as was the European eel. The artist cannot merely be the executive automaton of their blueprints and intentions, which, in any case, are in a state of continual development as the unconscious and unexpected repeatedly intervene to enrich, warp, and thwart the project. There has to be space for spontaneity, for the transformative imagination. Luckily for me, because so much of the life cycle and ecological context of the European eel is unknown or merely hypothesized, that is, as much defined by absence as it is by presence, it leaves lots of space in which the imagination can roam. As I have said earlier, the subject matter seemed to demand epic monology and the identification of a representative European eel to stand in lieu for the species as a hero. These were technical and structural choices. But in imagining the life cycle and journeying of the eel so fully, in so much detail, in the context of its presenting absences, the piece slowly transfigured into a form of conjuration. My intention to render a scientifically credible account of the life cycle and journeying of the European eel paradoxically led to the development of a supplanting shadow narrative born out of science's current inability, despite the huge progress made in the last several decades, to provide a complete or satisfactory account of the life of the eel, or for that matter, the purpose and nature of life itself, of the nature of the universe, or satisfactory answers to questions that theologians call ultimate questions, questions that deal with meaning, values, and purpose, which remain essentially dark. They can't tell me what I want to know. Thus, the internal pressures of the poem's dynamic force it to become speculative, generative, religious, and where rationality and the empirical method fall short, imagination steps in. As the poem progresses, the eel is increasingly presented as uncanny, an alien supernatural being, literally from another dimension. Aleister Crowley's technique for astral projection began with him visualizing an image of himself, which he called his body of light, into which he magically projected his consciousness. Using this vehicle, he could then travel through space and time. In the European eel, I have created a body of dark for the eel and projected the species into it. As the poem travels through space-time, the method and expression become more or less overtly Gnostic and occult, uncovering what is hidden, revealing secrets, and asserting vision and meaning. I'll now read 3 representative sections from the poem. The first section is the opening of the book. It narrates little eel's birth as a fertilized ovum in the depths of the Sargasso Sea, 100 miles or so offshore from Puerto Rico, her hatching into a larva or leptocephalus, and the beginning of her 3-year migration towards Europe on the current system of the North Atlantic Gaia, in the subtropical convergence zone of the southern Sargasso, over the edge of the Nares Abyssal, southeast of the Bermuda Ridge. Snow is rising in the water column from 1,500 feet. Somewhere in Tethys' salty darkness, in spurts of milt and billowing roe, eels are birthing their posterity. A spore storm of eggs in uncountable centillions, each buoyed on its micron of oil. The embryos float in the Miocene water like dust motes caught in a shaft of light, and ascending through the photocline, join the thermonuclear microplankton of the drifting epipelagic. In the 18-degree water, hatching, it is hypothesized, takes place after 2 days of embryonic growth, after which emerges the pinhead imago, veined, elongate, a leaf of transparent white willow, leptocephalus, the larval form of anguilla, absorbing its yolk sac for 10 or 12 days, lengthening daily by micrometers, gaining weight daily in micrograms, until a fortnight after hatching, the size of a sand grain or emphatic full stop, it unhinges its tiny gaping jaws, fangs half as long as its head, and hunts in the eutrophic blizzard, seizing diatoms, dinoflagellates, polyethylene microbeads, fueling up for the 30-month long haul, Sargasso to the Biscay abyssal. Sargasso, a bright lens of brine sitting light on the freeze of the Antarctic bottoms, herded to a hump by the North Atlantic Gaia. The desert sea, life confined to its turbulent edges, the highways of the eel, and the surface rafts of drifting sargassum from which it takes its name. The graveyard sea, swallower of troop ships and Grumman avengers, where the drowned float forever in zombied suspension and the albatross rots on the mirror. Columbus struck his prow right through it, en route to the New World's plunder, but he liked the Sargasso. Blue as the sky in Andalusia, fragrant as the air in Seville. The garbage sea, where the plastic of 3 continents forms mats the breadth of Spain. South of the plastic, offshore from Puerto Rico, leptocephali ride on the Antilles current. Feeding at night in the epipelagic, they in daylight descend to the dark of deep scattering, a phototaxic flight from the light and the deaths that lurk there. Harpooning cnidarians, the grip claws of krill, the lit jaws of the lanternfish, devoured in centillions, centillions riding still. A month or so since hatching, the size of an April tadpole, they move in the plankton like Pac-Man, simple machines of growth and devouring, deliverers of the savage telos written in their genes. They drift with the current, making 5 or 15 miles each day, beyond Grand Bahama to the Blake Escarpment, where the Florida current blows out from the strait on the plume of deep water horizon. There, between Andros Island and Biscayne Bay, it courses into the racing Antilles to form the Gulf Stream, a roaring salt river hurtling north on the edge of the American continental shelf, its estuaries of blight, estrogen-saturated sewage, methamphetamine neurotoxins, chromosome warping neonicotinoid runoff. The leptocephali soak it up and tumble to Hatteras with the flotsam of the current, single-use Canaveral space junk, the strip malls, car-tossed fast food trash, and radioactive manatees. So I'll now move to a second section where little eel and her fellow travelers have crossed the Atlantic and transformed into tiny eels known as elvers. By chance, they have entered the Humber River system on the east of England, facing the North Sea. They traveled up the Humber estuary into the River Ouse, taken a detour into the River Don, and turned off further into a very small South Yorkshire stream known as the Ea Beck. Now 10 or 12 inches long, the little eels, known colloquially as bootlaces, are looking for a stretch of stream in which they can take up residence and get on with the job of the next 10 or 20 years, to feed and to grow. Below Bullcroft Tips at Carcroft Common, the Beck runs under Watling Street, past the Asda Superstore and B&Q, between Richard's Hampole and Robin Hood's Well. In the approach to the thundering culvert under the Doncaster Wakefield Road, the Ea becomes the Hampole Dyke, and in a fly-tipped paddock below the landfill finds for the first time its natural meander. Staggers of alder and tangled willow, tussock-topped, flood-sheared cliffs. The eels rest up in rat holes, hunt fry in the willow's cool shade, until something in the water or in the coding of their genes sends them questing against the current. Another crawling culvert in the landfill's reek. They exit to the light in a sheer wall stream between the London-Edinburgh railway line and Stubbs Hall's leaky carp ponds. Blue shit leaked from chemical toilets, cormorants dribbling lead. Rats feeding from litter bins, discarded peg-side boilies. The little eels slither in the crisp bag flow and enter an ocean of drifting rape where the dike water stinks like Roundup and Fitches. Mink are patrolling the red brick cave under the shut-down colliery spur of the shut-down Hull and Barnsley Railway. Darkness releases them into darkness, the starless waters of Emsall Beck in the stench of the common end sewerage. Now 15 miles upstream from Don, only a handful of eels remain of the hundreds that passed the Thorpe in Bond control gate. Nowhere to go now. In 3 or 4 miles, the map's fine blue line will fritter in a maze of spring-fed trickles in the fields between Hemsworth and Kirby. But a quarter mile beyond the sewerage, in the flood-flattened rape below Lovett's garage, new water joins the flow. Prickly Beck, the barely a mile-long terminal flow of a tangle of tiny dikes and streams that rise from the clays between Watchcliffe and Ringstone Hill. A dozen or so divert and enter its current. They wriggle along the flat scraped silt in the sheerside drain of the Embank Channel and pass under the road to the ragwort horsefield in the shadow of Frickley Tips. Stridable stream, meandering under the bankside hawthorns in a foot or two of depth. Once a home for water rats and nesting bankside moorhens. That was before the mink. But even in this desultory trickle, with its workaday load of pesticides and occasional blights of cowshed slurry, the water world's intact. You can still tickle trout and riverfish flee before your footsteps, dace and gudgeon, bullhead and barbel, the odd patrolling pike. And eels, of course, buried under banks in the clefts of root balls, wherever the beck finds a yard or so of depth. At the tunnel lip under the H&B spur, only 3 from Sargasso remain to complete their ascent. The downstream dredging killed hundreds of eels, and some of the new ones took their vacant places. Herons prowl this easy water, and mink work the pool at the step of the tunnel, where the travelling eels are forced to attempt a grass snake slithering ascent. Only one makes it through and into Frickley Park. Here, the beck widens and deepens for a stretch as the flow backs up from the arch of the tunnel. The stream cuts across the pylon field between banks of nettles and the bollarded stumps of hawthorns. The surviving eel swims forward, winding between the banks, seeking a plot in which she can anchor for the next 15 or 20 years. She sniffs the waters with her periscope nostrils, wriggles into root knots and under debris dams. This stream has good feeding, bloodworm, caddis and fry, but already there are eels here, with gapes wide enough to swallow her skinny 9 inches whole. They loom from darkness, lunging and biting, taking chunks from her caudal and ventral fins, chasing her on upstream. Where the beck is straightened along Frickley Lane, she crawls along the ballasted shallows under a wall of gabion limestone. Here the waters flow fast and broken as the tumbling spate of Holywell Beck roars into the flow from a concrete pipe and roils in its rumbling plunge pool. The stones of the bridge the pipe replaced, along with the swallow's nest crusted to the ashlar, were abandoned in the flow to cause this foaming turbulence. The eel flashes under the feral white water and slides into the flat-bottomed deep-cut race that glints through the lattice of slashed-back quick a fathom below the lane. Hard banks here, no shelter, but shortly the stream begins to widen and find a little depth. Another pipe, another plunge pool, at the gateless gap facing Houghton Thorn Covert on the point of the nameless Foxhead Wood, waist deep and wide enough for a man to float on his back like Jesus. The covert side grassy, unhedged, the lane side a splinter of slashback hawthorn, a sycamore's overhang gloom. She reaches the pipe lip, only inches above her surface breaking head, submerges and circles the pool. Beneath the pipe drops trickle of fall, a dark eel rises, lunging from the rubble towards her. She flicks off in a plume of silt and continues to circle the sycamore shadow, snaking the caves of the submarine root ball. Rat smells, trout smells, effluent from the landrace piggery, stinks of dead pigeon, pheasant, and crow, bloodworm, caddis, and fry. Eel smell, but no incumbent eel. So under the bank of Frickley Beck, by the gateless gap at Houghton Thorn Covert, on the point of the nameless Foxhead Wood, she reaches the end of her 40-month journey. She knots her tail in a crevice of the root ball and pokes out her gape in a predatory billow of breathing. Now she waits and rests. So now I'll read the closing section of the book. Little Eel, having spent 15 years in Frickley Beck as a yellow eel, has silvered and made her 8-month migration back to Sargasso. A male eel has found her, and they travel together, beginning the culmination of their lives: courtship, breeding, and death. She's traveling west by north with the current, a curve offshore from windward. Swollen like a pomegranate, her roseate column thick with eggs, each microscopic seed of blood lit in its areole of vitaline gold. She winds in the flow like a length of fraying halyard, the edge of coming apart. He's swimming 100 yards behind her, locked on to her estrogen contrail. They drift for days in the whelming current, moving deeper into the fabled sea. 19 degrees north, 61 west, approaching the rise of the Puerto Rico Trench, 100 miles north of Barbuda. Blue blackness above, black blackness below. Waning crescent, 24% visible, faint glow of deep scatterings, bioluminescence. Diesel growl of longliners, trolling snoods for snapper. Humpback and pilot whales, wahoo and marlin, picking off the bounty. A continent of eels coming into fruition as far as fancy's lightless eye can see. Little males, 14-inch veterans of the hemispheric journey, hanging limp in the drift like branches of flaccid sargassum, completing their nuptial transformation. Others, already come into their ripeness, are riding the pheromone bow waves of females, girthy as pythons, 4 or 5 feet long. Soft explosions of pluming milt flare from mesopelagic darkness as all around them eels entwine and jettison their loads. The water stinks of sex and death, progesterone, testosterone, ichthyotoxic blood. She shivers in the warm aphrodisiac current, every nerve entingling, each tender tip engorged. He's drifting in her orbit now, homed in on her cloacal trail. He loops his snaky electron around her. She recoils and snaps her gaping rat-trap jaw. Not ready. So for the moment, they simply swim together. The 19-inch female, her underslung bicep of belly, and her swollen bootlace suitor. They drift with the current deep into black Sargasso. 20 degrees north, 62 west, the outer rise of the Puerto Rico Trench, 100 miles north of Anguilla. New moon, 1% visible. Kraken darkness, lit only by octopus phosphorescence and the bright detonations of ejaculating eels. They've been traveling in tandem for 5 days now, through frittering flames of fertilized ova and the disarticulate space junk fall of dead and dying eels. This is their predestiny, their inescapable fate, the fate of every Atlantic eel since the Yucatan asteroid dropped its apocalypse 50 million years ago, to ruin themselves in the act of breeding and die in the dopamine afterglow, drifting down from the towering heights of ocean to the black-red clays of the 5-mile abyss, layer upon layer upon Googolplexian layer. Their bodies are coming apart, held together only by shrink-wrapped skin and the kamikaze cerebellum that tells them live, to breed and die. They're running on neurosteroids now, their muscular strength exhausted. It's now or never. But her biochemical transformation is finally complete. The dark moon shudders in her teleost womb, and she's suddenly wreathed in sex. He stiffens and begins his dance around her, nosing the waters, advancing and retreating in a tentative submarine hokey-cokey. Like he's scared to get close, like he's got at least one glaucous eye on that gaping rat-trap jaw. She drifts and ignores him, gaping and closing that rat-trap jaw, beckoning him forward, until he finally plucks up the courage to touch, coming under and rubbing her pulsing belly with the nacelles of his head. He kneads the flesh of her underbody with a zigzag massage from pleated throat to vent. She gapes and twitches, swims, and for a while they move touch tight together, him coiling his cable round the rope of her body, constricting and releasing, bringing her to the edge. She gapes and twitches, apparently impassive, but a landslide has started inside her. He uncurls his coils and once more swims beneath her, nuzzling at her leaking vent like a typhoon fueling from a stratotanker, butting the bulge of her loosening row sack, triggering the sensory overload that will release them both into the ecstasy of body, the DMT and oxytocin rush of coitus and extinction. Milt pumps down the tube of his urethra and backs up at the sphincter of the vent. He stiffens and ejaculates a depth-charged blast of sperm. She shivers and her gold load slides. They couple in the milk cloud, lit in the shock of its bloom. Once more, he's frotting the flange of her vent and butting the walls of her colon. Once more, he ejaculates again and again until the hypertonic waters are smoking with milk and her shuddering body can hold it back no longer. She cracks like a whip and her body convulses, spurting gusher after gusher of glittering golden ova, sparks from the cornucopian flame of Archaea's unkillable dark pleroma, quickening through the mist of sperm and rising through the photocline to join the thermonuclear microplankton of the drifting epipelagic.